Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to World Civilizations Part 2, since 1500. My name is Dr. Joshua Haynes, and I'm going to be talking with you today about the Cold War. Now, during World War II, the Soviet Union fought the most crucial battles, such as Stalingrad, as Dr. Ross argued last time. And Russians bore the brunt of the bloodshed, as Dr. Ross told you. So Russia really is the main Allied victor in the war against Germany. Right, when the war is over, Russia controlled Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany. But Americans were becoming increasingly assertive in their relations with their allies because they knew that they alone possessed nuclear weapons. Now, what followed in this increasing test of wills was a 45-year-long struggle between the West and the East. And when I say the West here, I'm including the United States and the nations of Western Europe. And when I say the East, I'm including the Soviet Union and the nations of Eastern Europe. Now, the West and the East never fought each other openly, directly, in this 45-year-long struggle known as the Cold War. Instead, Americans and Soviets confronted each other globally. So, our major questions for today about the Cold War are these. Why and how did the Cold War develop? And second, how did the Cold War affect the rest of the world? And these are really going to be our major questions for the next couple of meetings. Today we're going to focus on how and why the Cold War developed between 1945 and 1949. And we'll begin touching on how the Cold War affected the rest of the world. Next time we'll really fill out that question. So why and how did the Cold War develop, and how did the Cold War affect the rest of the world? The Cold War divided the world between the two superpowers of the US and the Soviet Union. And it made any region in the world a possible arena of conflict. To understand the Cold War, we really have to start at the end of World War II in 1945. The US and the great powers of Western Europe had allied the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. US industrial output and Soviet manpower made victory possible. But this wartime alliance between the US and the Soviet Union would not last. The Soviet Union endured the worst of the bloodshed, right? More casualties than any other nation. The US, by contrast, experienced a mere fraction of the casualties that the Soviet Union experienced. Moreover, as Dr. Ross pointed out last time, the US had virtually no civilian casualties, only military casualties. Plus, and this is very important, the United States escaped the kinds of physical damage that the nations of Europe endured. Right? European and Japanese cities, factories, and farms were destroyed. Allied bombers had firebombed cities from Dresden to Tokyo, reducing them to rubble, ash, and sorrow. But the US was spared civilian, urban, and infrastructure damage. So in 1945, the United States was the most powerful nation in the world, militarily and especially economically. But the Soviet Union controlled more territory than any other nation on Earth. between 1945 and 1991, when the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, the conflict between these two superpowers defined global history. Now, in general, speaking very generally, the Cold War is defined by three things. First, continual military buildup on both sides. Continual military buildup. Second, a protracted battle of political ideologies. Democracy versus authoritarian communism. And ultimately, a protracted battle of economic ideologies. Communism versus capitalism. The United States and the Soviet Union struggle over this basic question. Will democratic capitalism or authoritarian communism prevail? As I mentioned a moment ago, the United States and the Soviet Union would never fight one another openly during this Cold War. Instead, they fight a series of proxy wars. They fight a series of so-called proxy wars. That is, the US and the Soviets support opposing factions in other wars. You've already read about some of these proxy wars in your textbook. I'll mention a couple today, and I'll go into some detail about some of these proxy wars next time. But for the next little while, we're going to focus on why and how the Cold War developed between 1945 and 1949. In 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States had these fundamentally different goals. They have fundamentally different post-war goals. So I'm going to spend the next several minutes sketching out these goals. And by doing so, try to get at how they end up in this intractable conflict. What exactly did Soviets want at the end of World War II? What was their strategy to get it? What do Soviets want, and what's their strategy to get it? Recall that during World War II, Germany had pledged not to invade Russia, but invaded anyway. And that betrayal led to alliance between the Soviets, the United States, and Western Europe. The Allies depended on Russian manpower to win. As Dr. Ross said last time, and as one of your primary documents for the day really emphasized. So how can this key alliance between the Soviets and the West, how does this key alliance end up in a bitter rivalry? Remember also that Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was a paranoid, ruthless, autocratic dictator. He's responsible for the deaths of millions of people. Remember that in the 1930s, Stalin had purged, arrested, and executed all of his political rivals. Why? Because he was convinced they were trying to remove him from power. In 1945, Stalin was convinced that the United States and Western European nations were threatening his power. So Stalin wants to build a Soviet empire to buffer his nation from the threat of any future invasion and from any influence by Western powers. In a sense, he wants to create a defensive empire. Russians had lived through 2 devastating world wars. They bore a disproportionate share of the casualties, the hardships. The German invasion had been particularly devastating. So Stalin is interested in building an empire as a defensive strategy. Protect the Soviet core. Now, the United States had also learned a lesson from World War II, one that it would never forget. France and Britain had appeased Germany when Hitler seized control of Czechoslovakia. They had appeased Hitler at the Munich Conference in 1938. And look what happened. So U.S. leaders decide they will never again appease aggression. Particularly, they'll never appease Soviet aggression anywhere on planet Earth. Never again. So, as the war comes to a close, the Soviets have this goal in mind: expansion to create a vast defensive empire. The great powers are sort of locked into this idea that they're not going to appease Soviet aggression. So in 1945, the great powers come together to create a new post-war world order between the East and the West, right, as the dominant powers. As early as 1944, the U.S., Britain, China, France, and the Soviet Union all agreed to create a new United Nations. And this new United Nations would replace the old League of Nations developed after World War I. So the UN is going to be this new international forum for diplomacy and conflict resolution. The three big powers, the three great powers, the US, Great Britain, and Russia, also began to discuss what post-war Europe would look like. And they did this at Yalta. The Yalta Conference in February 1945. At this Yalta Conference in February 1945, the big three powers decide several things. First, they'll divide Germany between them. Second, Poland will remain under Soviet control. Third, in exchange for that, Stalin will aid the United States in the war against Japan. And of course, as you know from the previous lecture and probably just from general knowledge, Russian assistance in the war against Japan ended up not being necessary because the United States dropped nuclear weapons. In any case, the other thing that happens, the other decision that gets made at Yalta is this. The big three agree that all the Eastern European countries Russia had liberated from Germany could have free and fair elections. All right, so look back at this map. All right. All these countries in Eastern Europe that Russia's liberated from Germany get to have free and fair elections so they can elect representative governments that respond to the will of the people. That's the agreement. That agreement reached at Yalta, of course, did not last. Indeed, the period of cooperation was shockingly brief. In May 1945, just weeks after the official end of the European War, what became known as the Iron Curtain was already visible. So, you've read for today this very famous speech from former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in which he coins this phrase, Iron Curtain. Churchill wrote that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. In short, Russia was attempting to divide Europe between a democratic West and a communist East. Despite the agreement at Yalta, Soviets declined to remove their armies from the Eastern European nations they had liberated from Germany. They declined to allow free and fair elections in these countries. By 1947, the Soviets had installed communist puppet governments in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and the Baltic states. As Churchill noted in the speech that you read, the Soviet Union had built a sphere of influence behind the so-called Iron Curtain. So essentially, by 1947, Russia had achieved its major goal. It's created this defensive empire by essentially placing puppet governments in these Eastern European countries. But in so doing, they had violated their agreement with the Western powers they had made at Yalta. Germany itself became the very center of this emerging Cold War conflict when the Allies partitioned it. France, Britain, and the US controlled the western part of Germany, and the Soviets controlled the eastern part of Germany. The city of Berlin itself in East Germany got partitioned. So here on this map you can see the US, French, and British controlled Western Germany zones. Here the Russian controlled East Germany, and right here the city of Berlin in Eastern Germany. The city itself gets partitioned. Let's switch to this map where you can see the city a little more clearly. So where is the United States during all this? What's in it for them, right? What do Americans want at the end of World War II? What strategies are they using to get what they want? Enter a man named George Kennan. In 1946, George Kennan was a State Department diplomat assigned to the Soviet Union. And George Kennan was considered an expert on Russia. Kennan recommended a policy that he called containment. Basically, Kennan argued that the communist Soviet Union must not be allowed to expand its sphere of influence anywhere in the world beyond Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union must not be allowed to expand its sphere of influence anywhere in the world beyond Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union must be contained. Now, so what the U.S. wants, right, is, above all, the U.S. wants to contain Soviet expansion, contain Soviet power, contain Soviet influence. Now, as George Kennan formulated it, containment policy was supposed to be non-interventionist. Right? It's supposed to be a mostly hands-off approach. Containment policy would use incentives, not force. It would use economic incentives to entice nations into the Western sphere of influence, the American sphere of influence. Kennan understood that Soviets were motivated by fear, that they were creating this defensive empire. So he advised against doing anything that could be perceived as threatening. Use incentives, not force. So Kennan is arguing that the U.S. should simply use material, economic support of allies to preempt Soviet expansion. That is, the U.S. should get all the nations of the world enmeshed in a global capitalist economy that brought prosperity to all. Right? If the U.S. could do that successfully and enmesh the nations of the world in a global capitalist economy that brings prosperity to all, then the nations of the world would have no incentive to flirt with Soviet communism. Now, by late 1947, President Harry Truman faced an opportunity to test containment policy. But Harry Truman makes containment more aggressive, more interventionist than Kennan intended. So the context is this. A civil war was then raging in Greece between homegrown communists on one side and a monarchy on the other. Great Britain had been supplying the Greek government, the Greek monarchy, while the Soviet Union was providing aid to those homegrown Greek communists. But by 1947, Great Britain could no longer afford to fund the Greek government in its war against homegrown communists. So they appealed to the United States for help. They asked Truman to start funding the Greek government. And Truman responded with what has become known as the Truman Doctrine. And again, this is one of the places where your primary document for the day can help out. As you know from reading Truman's speech, he asked Congress to provide $400 million in economic aid to help the Greek government defeat a homegrown communist movement. So when you think about the Truman Doctrine, think about it as putting the containment policy into action, but also making it more aggressive, more interventionist. Truman said, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." And so if you sort of parse that sentence, Truman is demonstrating here that he wants to fight communism anywhere it pops up in the world. He's making containment policy operate by force, not solely by incentive. Or by funding the Greek government's war against homegrown communists, Truman is engaging the United States in the first of several proxy wars around the world, between the U.S. funding one faction and and Soviets funding another. And these kinds of proxy wars, where the US funds one faction and the Soviets fund another, will become kind of standard operating procedure throughout the rest of the Cold War. Now, the Marshall Plan was another sort of key US strategy in the Cold War to help contain Soviet influence. But the Marshall Plan is an example of containment policy operating on economic incentive rather than force. So what's the Marshall Plan, and why should any of us care? Well, remember, World War II had physically devastated much of Europe. Industrial and agricultural output had all but collapsed. Europeans were cold, hungry, and desperate. Socialist ideas often appeal to people who are poor and desperate because socialism offers a solution to their deprivation. The US wanted to forestall the growth of European homegrown communist movements. The US wants to enmesh the nations of Europe in a global capitalist economy. To accomplish that, the US initiated the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1951, the Marshall Plan poured $13 billion, that's 13 billion with a B, $13 billion of aid into European economic recovery and reconstruction. Any European nation, including the Soviet Union, could apply for U.S. economic aid. Soviets declined that aid, viewing the whole Marshall Plan as an imperialist scheme. And to be clear, that's not an entirely inaccurate, unfair criticism, right? With the Marshall Plan, the United States really is trying to ensure that all the nations of Europe and their economies follow a capitalist model. So just as one example, the US was eager to help revive the French textile industry. Thousands of bales of American cotton, as pictured here, were sent to the French port of Le Havre to get French mills spinning again. Put French men back to work, earning pay, spending money. Now, in 1947 and 1948 were crucial years in the development of the Cold War. US and Soviet leaders sort of hardened their ideological positions, and they came within a whisker of open, direct warfare. Soviets attempted to force the United States, France, and Great Britain to give up the divided city of Berlin in eastern Germany. The Allies had access to a road through Soviet-controlled East Germany that they used to supply and trade with their zones in the city of Berlin. In 1947, the Soviets closed that access road. U.S. leaders believe that accepting this action, accepting their exclusion from the city of Berlin, would be tantamount to appeasement. It would be just like giving Czechoslovakia up to Hitler in 1938. So So the U.S. began what's become known as the Berlin Airlift. For 8 months, the U.S. flew in daily deliveries to West Berlin. 13,000 tons of food, medicine, fuel, and equipment every day. It's a very tense situation. Now, ultimately, the Soviet Union backed down and reopened the access road through eastern Germany. But things could very easily have gone the other way in the Berlin Airlift. The United States could have dropped bombs instead of chocolate bars. For the moment, at least, cooler heads prevailed. By 1949, it was clear that the United States and the Soviet Union viewed one another as enemies. And they began, or continued, to permanently militarize the Cold War. That trend increased in 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully tested a nuclear weapon. The U.S. and several of its allies created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as a collective defense against rising Soviet military power. NATO initially included 12 member nations, and of course others have been added over time. NATO still exists today. But initially, the NATO allies were focused on the Soviet Union. And they're all pledged to contain Soviet influence, Soviet power. They agree that an attack on any member nation constituted an attack on all. Now, when NATO admitted West Germany as a member nation in 1955, the Soviet Union responded by creating its own military alliance between 7 communist nations, the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact. So after this, countries all over the globe began to sort of align themselves with either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. So, the Iron Curtain descended across the continent of Europe, dividing the Soviet sphere of influence in the east from the American and Western European sphere of influence in the West. The U.S. responded to this drawing of the Iron Curtain with containment policy, exemplified by the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the creation of NATO. U.S. and Soviet leaders effectively split the world in 3. Right? The West, the East, and the global South. The West claims to support democracy and capitalism. But, as you know from your textbook reading, the U.S. often supported authoritarian dictators, even terrorists, in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. American leaders just don't care if they're anti-democracy, as long as they're anti-communist. On the other hand, the Soviet Union was a bastion of authoritarian communism. By 1949, the U.S. had adopted this rigid Cold War mentality focused on containing Soviet influence everywhere, all the time, at any cost. Events in Asia in 1949 only deepened that rigid Cold War mentality. In his lecture on World War II, Dr. Ross noted that Chinese communists had been fighting a civil war against Chinese nationalists throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. They put that internal conflict on hold, at least briefly, during World War II, as both factions fought against Japanese invaders. But when World War II ended, China's war resumed. And in 1949, Mao Zedong's communists defeated Chinese nationalists. Now, the Soviet Union welcomed the successful Chinese Communist Revolution. But make no mistake, this is a homegrown Chinese communist revolution, through and through. Indeed, the Soviet Union gave more economic aid to non-communist countries like Egypt than it gave to China. But in the United States, conservatives insisted that someone had lost China. Who lost China? Somebody lost China. And Americans assumed that somehow the victory of Chinese communism in its own civil war was the result of American failure to intervene. In reality, there was no failure to intervene. The United States had invested $2 billion in military aid to prop up Chinese nationalists, and the communists still beat them. Chinese communists win their civil war and take control of China in 1949. Remember, 1949, the same year Russia acquires nuclear weapons. Those two events just lock Americans deeper into this rigid Cold War mindset. U.S. leaders recommit to relentlessly opposing communism everywhere in the world at any cost. And now the specter of mutual nuclear annihilation just further clouds everyone's judgment. In 1950, the Truman administration adopted a new and more aggressive foreign policy. Call it NSC 68. NSC 68. The Truman administration adopts this new, more aggressive national security policy, NSC 68. NSC 68 declared that the U.S. would strive for victory over the Soviets. Not just contain them, strive for victory. To do that, the U.S. began a massive, permanent increase in military spending. American leaders assumed that diplomacy is useless. War is inevitable. And so they prepared for war. For example, increased U.S. military spending paid for a new atomic weapon, the hydrogen bomb. many times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. This rigid Cold War mentality, this expectation of war, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And ultimately, the reactionary stance cost tens of thousands of American lives, billions of American dollars in proxy wars in Greece, Iran, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Guatemala, and several other places. But it began in Korea. So we'll pick up the story there next time with the Korean